It's a great honor to be giving the Kapuscinski lectures. I think this lecture is going to be using the methods of economics and quantitative analysis and maybe a little bit of modeling. But I think any serious development economics has to be predicated on a on-the-ground understanding of the society in which you're working and knowing the context. And Kapuscinski was wonderful at that. And I think he exemplified that. But to some extent, even by reading his work, I think I found it to be very, very insightful, and I felt like I was able to absorb a little bit of that secondhand. So I definitely, for those of you who haven't yet read Kapuscinski, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's really wonderful work. And I also want a few more thanks. I wanted to thank everybody for coming on Valentine's Day. Much appreciated. I'd like to thank, this is a somewhat unusual talk. There's a huge number of people whose work I'm going to draw on in a discussion tonight. That's in part because I'll be drawing on the work of an NGO, which I should disclose. I helped found together with Sean Cole, which set up to try to do work in this area of digital agricultural extension. But we put a lot of emphasis on trying to measure impact and trying to learn about the field. And so this is really going to draw on the work of a lot of people associated with PAD, as well as other people who work in the field who are not part of PAD. Okay, so there's across a variety of sectors, there's, I think, a lot of very exciting developments in the use of information and communication technology for development. So let me just give you a few examples. So in health, the mobile phone apps to both provide information, but also to provide some performance management systems for community health workers have shown to have quite substantial effects, a 20% increase in actual visits to patients, for example. India is in the process of scaling that up to its more than 1 million community health workers. This is going to, the benefit cost ratio of something like this can be tremendous. In education, there's great work by Chris Nielsen in Chile and Dominican Republic and Justin Hastings in the US, showing that in a lot of settings there's school choice, but parents have very weak information. And providing parents with more information about the options for education can yield greatly improved outcomes. There's also cases where just government functioning can be improved through ICT. So some work that I think I saw Torsten in the group audience here, so a PhD student here, Torsten Walter's done, just documents the enormous variation within poor countries in the pupil-teacher ratio across schools. Well, that's the sort of thing with better, there may be a lot of reasons for that. There may be deep political reasons for that. But at least Torsten's hypothesis is that a lot of the variation is actually within very small areas. It's not all sort of greater political influence for one place than the other. Now, obviously, that's a hypothesis. But to the extent that turns out to be the case, then better information and communication technology might help address some of those inequities and perhaps also lead to better outcomes for students. I'm doing some work with Guthrie Gray-Loeb and Willa Friedman on also in education, on assignment of new teachers to schools. These are not regular civil service teachers, they're sort of semi-volunteers. Right now they're assigned randomly, or they had been assigned randomly, but the Kenyan government's just been introducing a process, a matching algorithm that tries to take into account the preferences of teachers and eventually could take into account schools' preferences as well. So this is the sort of matching algorithm Al Roth is known for. And just as it's make life much easier for medical students being assigned to residencies in the US, this could make life easier for schools and teachers in Kenya, potentially. Give a couple of other examples. Social benefit administration. Work in India suggests that the employment guarantee scheme, a very large program, there's a lot of leakage that could be improved both by having biometric smart cards India's had a huge program to give everybody a unique identity that can reduce leakage, that was found to reduce leakage tremendously. And then just improving the flow of funds by being able to send funds not through multiple layers of bureaucracy, but straight from the state government to the village level, was also found to substantially reduce losses. Okay? This could be used in taxes, so work in Italy. Italy's been doing this to try and get a whole bunch of properties that are not on the property tax rolls, to identify them using satellite data and then get them on the tax rolls. And a huge innovation in worldwide tax policy worldwide has been the very rapid spread of value-added taxes, which went from a very low level decades ago and are now almost ubiquitous. One of the big advantages of value-added taxes, in theory, is that by comparing the tax submissions of the suppliers and of the purchasers, you can cross-check, and that could reduce fraud in taxation. Often, while that's theoretically possible, it's not actually done. Well, better ICT could potentially allow that to happen. So there's across a range of areas, there's at least theoretical potential, and whether this happens in practice is a very important question, which I'll touch on later. There's at least theoretical potential for technology to address problems of functioning of governments in developing countries. So you can see this as a way that could potentially contribute to the broader issue of state capacity. I don't want to exaggerate, and I'm trying to be careful not to exaggerate. There's a lot of issues in state capacity that go well beyond anything that technology can address, but technology may be able to help. Okay. This talk will focus on the case of agriculture. Let me give a bit of background. There are 450 million poor smallholder farmers around the world, and obviously many more people that are dependent on those farms. There's over 1 million agricultural extension workers whose job is to provide agricultural information on inputs to use, on crop choice, et cetera, to farmers. Those systems they basically, in many developing countries, they don't work very well at all. There's not much evidence of impact or cost effectiveness. It's pretty expensive to send agricultural extension workers out into the field and to meet individually with farmers or even in groups. But of course, that even assumes that they get out to the field, and often they don't. And that's partly because of bureaucratic problems. There's no funding for transportation, just for the salaries. But it's also because of accountability problems that plague governments in many ways. It's just hard to supervise an agricultural extension workers and make sure they're doing their jobs. There's also corruption when they play a role in distributing inputs or subsidized inputs. There's often a lot of corruption as well. So these systems are often considered to be not very effective. Here are some statistics from India that just illustrate that point. Okay. So there's at least reason to think that there might be potential for mobile phones to play a big role in this area. So it's very low cost to transmit the information. Cell phone, when you think about the cost of sending cell phone messages, don't think the amount that you have to pay. Think the actual social technological cost, which is very close to zero, because rural cell phone capacity is underused. Once the cell phone's there, it can handle a certain amount of traffic. And in rural areas, that traffic typically it's not at capacity. Moreover, you can send things off at times that are off-peak. So it can be very low cost. It can be, I think, when I wrote reliable, it may not be as reliable as the cell phone network that you might hope, but it's probably much, much more reliable than other forms of delivery, where any breakdown along the chain can mean that either the message isn't delivered at all or the message gets garbled. It can be provided in a timely way, so you can time to the agricultural season, or you can time to a pest outbreak or to some adverse weather conditions. You can customize this based on a variety of things, most obviously things like soil conditions, soil chemistry, which inputs are needed would depend on how much nitrogen's in the soil, et cetera. But you can also customize this to market conditions. So, for example, you might not want to suggest use of an input that isn't available in the local area. Now, actually implementing this can be a big challenge, but at least theoretically there's that possibility. Or output markets, how are there, if you're producing a crop like vegetables to sell to the city, then you need to be able to actually get that picked up and transported to the city, and if that's not going to happen, it may not be a good crop to grow, but that could potentially be coordinated and facilitated in part through technology. Mobile phones, one of the big findings in agricultural extension is that this shouldn't be thought of as a one-way system of extension agents transmitting information to farmers. Farmers have a lot of information themselves. Now, theoretically, a well-functioning agricultural extension collects that information from farmers and feeds it back into the system. So the agricultural researchers are aware of the problems farmers are facing in the field, for example. But all too often in developing countries, that system doesn't work very well for all sorts of institutional and sociological reasons in very hierarchical environments. The mobile phone systems, at least potentially, could be designed to collect information from farmers as well, get questions from farmers that are recorded, and I'll give you some examples of that later on, and have responses developed. I think there are gains from communicating with farmers and getting both ways, but there could also be gains from integration with other systems. So I mentioned that extension workers often, the performance of extension systems is often very weak. Well, extension workers could be provided with more information, so they could have, most farmers would just have feature phones. They can't do anything very advanced, but extension workers either have or will soon have smartphones. So they could play videos to farmers. They could communicate with the farmers in their area about, say, if they're going to be doing a demonstration plot in a particular area and a particular technique, they could inform farmers about that. You could also help monitor, potentially, the work that extension workers are doing, making sure that they go out and visit the farmers rather than that they're supposed to. Don't worry, I'm singing the potential praises, but I'm going to come back to what the realities are. I mentioned some of the opportunities to integrate with suppliers and purchasers. I talked about the purchaser side, but on the supplier side, farmers could shop around for prices. There's problems of bad fertilizer or adulterated fertilizer. Maybe there are ways to help address that. There's a lot of interest right now in integration with financial service providers. If lenders know, based on satellite data and other data from a farmer, whether the harvest is looking good, maybe then that could influence their lending decisions. I'm maybe a little bit less gung-ho about that than the market is right now, but there are a lot of efforts in that direction. Or provision of insurance or social insurance. I think, again, I think private insurance markets are very hard to put together typically, with some exceptions, but social insurance can be provided. If you know what's going on insuring an individual farmer may be difficult because there could be problems of moral hazard or adverse selection, but providing social insurance for farmers in a particular area, if you see that they're all having a bad harvest, then that's something that can be insured against. Okay. Just to add on to this, I think a lot of the things that I've listed are things that aren't being done and probably are a bit down the road and couldn't be done easily right away. But I think there are a number of technological advances that will create more opportunities for this. And this is partly data science advances, so that could improve weather forecasts, could improve better understanding of soil chemistry based on a limited number of samples, that could allow improvement of tailoring of messages to even what farmers have responded to in the past. It's possible to get better data on physical conditions, even using remote sensing. So spectroscopic analysis of soils can tell you a lot about the chemistry. There's work to try and look at what yields are based on satellite images. That's very exciting. Drones can play a role. And it's possible, so that makes it possible to collect a lot of information. But the widespread adoption of phones makes it possible to deliver some of this, but can be delivered in a much more sophisticated way once people have smartphones. And then I think there's also social science advances, in particular behavioral economics, I think can add a fair amount to this. Okay, so what we'll try and do in this talk, sort of laid out some potentially far off visions there, but I'd like to start off with just very basic systems. And what's some evidence, let's start off with just what's some evidence on just farmer behavior response. So a precondition for any of these things is that farmers would actually respond. So we'll start off looking at simple systems and what the impact is on farmer behavior. I think we've now got a fair amount of data on that. Then I'll look at data on yields, which I think is more limited and is tricky to collect for reasons I'll explain. But I think there's suggestive evidence on that, which is, I think, encouraging. Some analyses of cost effectiveness, which suggests this is actually the impacts, I don't want to say are huge, they're modest in absolute terms, but they are really huge in benefit cost terms because this is so cheap, even with existing technologies. I think they could potentially get better. Talk a little bit about some environmental outcomes as well. I'd like to discuss a bit emerging evidence on spillovers of knowledge. This may benefit not just the farmers who directly get the information, but other farmers. And some evidence on whether farmers could provide information, and some implications for overall design of the system and comment what we're learning about typical mistakes. So this will be sort of straight evaluation work. But then in the second part of the talk, I'd like to bring in more economic theory and some data that relates to that, both on the two scaling strategies for this. Are two broad classes, market-based scaling strategies and scaling by government. And I think neither of these are going to be perfect, but I think the tools of economics can be very useful in thinking about some of the trade-offs with each, and what strategies within market-based and government-based solutions might be most effective. Okay? So as I say, most of the evidence has been gathered by Precision Agriculture for Development, collaboration with researchers, but also in collaboration with implementers. So those are governments in some cases, companies in others, NGOs. While I'll focus on agriculture, I think some of the lessons, I'll try and come back to this, are relevant more broadly for technology-enabled information provision. So for example, in the educational context, and helping people make decisions about, make more informed decisions about about educational choices. Okay. I will also be making the argument that the knowledge that we can gain through experimentation of this type is really a global public good, and that the economics of that are also worth thinking about. Okay, so that's background. Start out with some evidence on impact before talking about scaling through markets and then through governments. So let me start off with what's called a meta-analysis. So this combined evidence from a number of different studies that we've done that we're looking at the problem of soil acidity. So a lot of soils in developing countries or particularly in Africa, East Africa, are acidic. And they become more acidic over time as they continue to be farmed. Soil acidity can be addressed with lime. So those of you who are home gardeners probably have some experience with this. And so the simple question was, if people get messages about this through a cell phone, and we'll start off with the very simplest type of message, the cheapest and lowest tech, which is just an SMS message. You can think of a lot of reasons why this wouldn't work. People get a lot of spam. They might ignore the messages. There are problems of literacy. Lots of reasons why this might, and they might not be able to afford the lime. They might not believe in the lime, all sorts of issues. But we did a meta-analysis of several different programs using the administrative data. In all of these cases, we had ways of collecting administrative data on purchases from one particular source. So a lot of this work was with a large NGO called 1 Acre Fund, which provides inputs on credit to farmers. So we were able to get data on their sales. Okay? That suggests we got typically a 19%, or sort of averaging across these, settings of increase in following Lyme recommendations. That was typically on a modest base. Not many farmers start out using Lyme, although now more and more of them are. So that's nothing to sneeze at, but it's not something that's going to be transformative. The effects in self-reported data, by the way, are larger. I'm not sure which of these. I think probably this might be an underestimate because some people might buy through other channels. I suspect that these self-reported data are an overestimate. There's a methodological lesson there about limitations of just relying on self-reported data. But even with these more conservative administrative data, this suggests benefit-cost ratios, sort of 6 to 36-fold. Even if there's no long-lasting effect of this, even if it's just the effect in that year and it goes away thereafter. Okay. There's starting to put together evidence, and it's preliminary at this stage, but suggests that there's information spillovers. It's not just the people with the phones who are benefiting, but it's also there are some members of One Acre Fund who don't have phones, particularly in Rwanda, and it looks like they're benefiting from this as well. It doesn't look, there may be some persistence of this, but you certainly don't get full persistence of this into the next agricultural season. So that, if this were purely a model of learning in a classical Bayesian rational learning framework, you might expect this to persist. You try it out, you realize it's good, you keep using it. It could be that you realize it's bad, and that's why it doesn't persist, but I actually don't think that's what's going on because the trends overall are going upwards, and the program remains effective. So there's no evidence, for example, of message fatigue. People who get a message the next year are also adopt. They're less likely to adopt. I think this may actually shed, this would be a separate talk, but I think this may shed some light on behavioral models of learning, behavioral models of input use more generally. We checked for another type of possible downside of sending too many messages, right? I think we all get a lot of messages that we'd rather not get in our email. Maybe this is negative spillovers on other things. So One Acre Fund is an NGO that's trying to do all sorts of things. It's trying to provide fertilizer, it's trying to tell people about solar lights and health practices. We didn't see any evidence of negative effects, and in fact, at least some suggestive evidence of some positive spillovers in other areas, which might be in part because Lyme helps directly, but it also makes other inputs more effective. We did a lot of work on message tailoring, so we've run a lot of different varieties of messages, and I'm not going to go into that, but there's some potential differences there, but I don't think we know yet whether things are robust, so I'm going to not discuss that today. One thing I want to emphasize is, if you're trying to do this type of work, you'll need very large samples. So in some cases, there were hundreds of thousands of farmers involved. That's because there's a lot of, we shouldn't get overly optimistic about the impact that a mobile phone message is going to have, given all the other constraints that farmers face. So we're not going to see necessarily huge effects. Particularly, that's even true with behavior, but certainly if we're going all the way through to yields, there are so many other things, there's so much background noise in yields, it's hard to pick up effects without a large sample. Now, it's one thing to pick up the overall effect, but if you're trying to get heterogeneous effects of different phrasing of the messages, you need pretty large samples. Okay? But you're able to get those. The other thing that I think is very helpful is meta-analysis, because sometimes something will show up in one study, but you don't know, is that real? Well, economists tend to say, well, we should write down a pre-analysis plan. The way that scientists often work is they say, well, we do some experiments to generate our hypotheses, and then we do another experiment to actually test them. And this is a setting where you can, if you're working with partners, you can definitely do that, because you can do repeated experiments over time in the same way that a tech firm might do them. Okay. Let me give a little bit of evidence on higher touch approaches. So this is a study that I wasn't involved in, using video in Bihar. So they were trying to promote an approach to rice cultivation that uses less water and fewer inputs in general. And they saw an increase in adoption of 6 percentage points on a base of 11%. So that's a bigger effect than from these SMS messages, and that suggests that perhaps going to more higher touch technologies might have a bigger impact. I don't want to, we don't have a meta-analysis of video yet. But let me talk about another higher tech approach that doesn't involve video, but does involve voice-based mobile advisory systems. So the SMS messages, that was just a few, few SMS messages per season. So it's very, very light touch. People are getting weekly push calls with advice and weather forecasts and so on. Farmers could also ask questions via a hotline. Then that would go to a group of agronomists who would record responses, and that would be made available to other farmers. Farmers could also respond to each other and share info with each other. Okay. That program, first, I just want to stress the very high levels of uptake of this. So if you look, most farmers called into the line. Quite a number of them, 40% of them, actually asked a question. A bunch of them, 17% recorded a message or responded to questions. And people generally stayed on the line throughout the push call. Let me mention this for a couple of reasons. First, I think these are pretty impressive numbers. But second, and I should say, I wish I was involved with this study. This is Cole and Fernando's work, not mine. If you look down here, you'll get the citations. But this type of data, so if you can get data on how long, which messages are people staying on the line for, which they aren't, those are all intermediate outcomes that you can study and you can do A/B tests on to try and find out what messages work better and which ones don't. That may improve the system, but if you're interested in maybe drawing more general behavioral lessons, you may be able to get that from it as well. Okay? So this suggests farmers are willing to contribute information that they find it worth spending their time on. Okay? What about productivity increases? So these are the point estimates that suggest substantial productivity increases, 8.6% for cotton and 28% for cumin. There's only one star on this one, so I don't think the case is airtight here. They had multiple outcomes. But the point estimate is $100 per season increase per farm. So that's but that is just marginally significant. There's also some evidence of information spillovers, which will tend to make it harder to pick up the effect, but are economically interesting in their own right. Here's another case where we were able to measure output. So in a lot of cases, take 1 Acre Fund, they supply inputs for maize farmers. The farmers then eat the maize, they take it to local market, they sell it. It's very hard to measure yield in that setting. You could go out and try and do crop cuts, but that's very, very expensive. There's work trying to take photographs from satellites. That's very exciting technology, but not necessarily quite ready to use except in research to improve the methodology right now. Maybe in a year it'll be there, but we worked with a big sugarcane company. So for sugarcane and a number of other crops, farmers, processing is very intensive. So there's a natural monopoly for the sugarcane processing facility, and farmers typically in an area typically sell to that company. So if you work with a company, the company then can give inputs to farmers on credit, so they have data on the inputs. But they also have data on the output because that's what they have to weigh the sugar and pay the farmer accordingly. So we did a couple of trials. One of them found that the SMS messages raised sugarcane yields 8%, and actually only 2/3 of the farmers actually got the messages, so really almost 12% overall. Second trial, we found smaller effects that were not statistically significantly different from zero, but they also weren't. We also couldn't reject a 7% yield gain. So why these different effects? Well, at this point, I can't tell you. Maybe it's just random sampling variation. We couldn't reject that hypothesis. It could also be, as I'll tell you later, this sugarcane company was going through a very difficult period, a lot of management problems. Maybe farmer trust in this company was declining over time. I don't think we know, but this is all speculative. But this does suggest that, in contrast to the maize example, where we couldn't reject that there was very similar effects for these studies, there's at least across studies. Here, there's at least some evidence of that maybe subtle differences can matter. Okay? But could just be sampling variation. Okay? There was another study that we did with the same company. This was quite different. Okay? This was looking not at the information that can be supplied to farmers, but the information that farmers can supply. So, as I mentioned, this sugarcane company provides inputs to farmers on credit. So they provide the fertilizer. Well, you have to apply the fertilizer at the right time. If you apply it outside of that time, there's going to be a lower yield response. If there's a lower yield response, that's very bad for the farmer. They've just bought these inputs on credit. Now they're not going to get what they expected out of them, and they're still going to have to pay back this money. So for farmers to complain about this was quite a hassle. They often, it was a very big catchment area. They might have to travel many hours to get to the company to complain to somebody. Even if they complain to someone, they're going to complain to a low-level official who will talk to their supervisor, will talk to their supervisor, talk to their supervisor. This is all within the one department of the company. And then it's an entirely separate department that actually does the deliveries of the inputs. So they'd have to get the message over to that other part of the company. So just from an organizational perspective, that process wasn't working very well. So then it's really not worth trying to complain about this. You just hope it's going to show up later. Well, with a hotline, farmers could call in, and that data could be aggregated and supplied to the top management of the company in a much easier to understand way. And that led to a pretty dramatic reduction in some cases, in a small number of cases, but 10% of cases, farmers weren't getting their inputs at all. So that went down by 30%. And then there was a 20% reduction in late delivery of fertilizer. So that's an example where information from farmers is actually very valuable, and farmers have an incentive to provide that information. This also benefited nearby farmers, because if they weren't delivering fertilizer in one area, into a particular farmer, they probably weren't delivering it to their neighbors either. So we saw gains there as well. Okay, so what are some lessons on just the impact? So across a variety of settings, we saw gains that were, at least for the simplest systems, pretty modest in absolute terms, although some of these gains I'm talking about now are they'll make a real difference to the lives of a farmer. The fact, I've noted that earlier that you'll need large sample sizes to pick up subtle differences across messages. But while I've said they're modest in absolute terms, they're very large relative to the marginal costs. And at least they have the potential to be, particularly these somewhat more advanced systems. And that suggests that when they're large relative to the marginal cost, the cost of a cell phone message, that suggests that to make this effective, this has the potential to be very effective, but only if it's done at large scale. If you're doing a small scale system, it's not going to be nearly as cost effective, because you have to design the system, get the technology in place, work with the phone company, test the messages, et cetera. Those are all lessons about these simple systems. There's the bit of evidence that we have about the more technologically complex systems suggests the gains can be much more substantial there. So I would characterize this as saying, this is quite a big win in terms of rate of return on investment. There's the potential for quite a big win, not a very big win in terms of rates of return on investment. I would say quite a big. This was 6 to 36-fold, so huge actually, but could be truly enormous with some of the newer technologies. Okay. So then, how would you scale this? So let me turn to the more economics-y part of this talk. So one approach is through markets, another approach is through governments. And here, let's start with the markets. There are a lot of, I'm starting with that partly because economists are trained to do that, but partly because most of the organizations that are working in this area, and there are a number of startups, there's startup for-profit firms, there's NGOs with the social enterprise model. Most of them are trying a market-based approach. And in particular, trying a subscription-based approach, where they charge a farmer for messages, okay? And a lot of, not only are organizations trying this, but the funders who put money into this, I don't know about the European Union program, but typically they make that a key metric for judging, is the organization succeeding or not? Are they getting to the point where they're covering, if you're covering none of your costs, that's bad. If you're covering 10%, 20%, we're starting to see progress, and 60%, but they want you to aim for 100%. And the question is, are you going to get there? That's the metric. They look at this the same way a private investor would. Okay? Even though it's mostly socially oriented organizations that are making these investments right now. Okay? I'm going to argue that economics suggests very important limits of that approach. Now, to be clear, there's also very important limits of a government-based approach. We're dealing in a second-best world at best. So I'll discuss that later on. Let me start with the very basic. There's a bunch of very interesting economics of information. Let me start with the observation that goes back to Arrow and before, but Romer's work recently received a lot of recognition for his articulation of it. And it's a very simple point. The cost of a mobile phone message is basically zero. That's going to create both static distortions. So here's a standard monopoly pricing diagram. Here's a demand curve. Let's price on this axis, the quantity purchased on this axis. There's some people who value this a lot. There are other people who don't value it nearly as much. A provider, let's take a monopoly provider to start with. They're going to choose the profit maximizing price. That's going to mean a bunch of people put positive value on this, but less than the profit maximizing price are not going to be served, and that's deadweight loss. So that's one problem with this. Okay, another problem with this is the total revenue that's collected is just this rectangle. Some of this will be consumer surplus that goes to the customers, but are they going to invest in setting up the system? There are important costs of setting up the system, as I mentioned earlier. Well, in a situation, what would a social planner do? Well, the social planner would invest if the fixed cost is less than the entire area under the demand curve, because then the social benefits of this exceed the cost of setting up the system. The monopolist is only going to invest if the potential revenue exceeds the cost of setting up the system. So there may be cases in which it's socially optimal to invest, but it won't be profitable for a firm to do that. Is that empirically relevant? That's the question. But let me start with this. There's other bits of theory I'd like to bring in, but let me start with this one. Okay. By the way, I should note that this diagram is assuming that this is a non-rival good in Romer's terminology, predates Romer, but that he emphasizes. But this is in some ways the best case. I'm assuming what's called full excludability here. The only people who get access to the information are the people who purchase it from the monopolist. And that might not be true, as I'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so here's some data, also from work of Cole and Fernando in India. And this tries to estimate the demand curve for this information. So you remember that the yearly increase, I gave the seasonal increase before, the yearly increase in profitability, their estimate is $200. Okay, it costs about $20 to provide. These SMS messages cost virtually nothing, and their social cost is virtually nothing. But these are weekly voice messages, and it has agronomists recording the answers. It's not nothing for this service. Okay, how much were farmers willing to pay? Well, they were willing to pay on average, about $2 for a 6-month subscription. So the social value of this looks pretty high, but the willingness to pay of farmers is nowhere near as big. So this is going to be something where, and their calculations suggest, it's not going to be possible to launch this as a profitable product. Okay, now, that doesn't mean nothing. Maybe in another society with somewhat richer farmers, or if costs come down, maybe it eventually would. But it's not going to be profitable privately in their context. But let me point something else out. I drew a stylized linear demand curve before. But demand curves in the real world often look much more like this. Okay, in this type of a setting, if you imagine inscribing a rectangle here, you'll see there's going to be a lot of deadweight loss relative to that rectangle. And moreover, that rectangle is going to be a fairly small fraction of the area under the demand curve. So you'll have the static distortions and the dynamic distortions can both be pretty severe. Okay? And that's, their data suggests that that's going to be the case as well in this setting. Okay? But there's also a puzzle being generated here. Why are people willing to pay so much less than what seems to be the value of the service? Okay? So let me talk about some other issues here. I'm going to give, actually, before I do that, let me give another example. This suggests that this isn't unique to India. So this is a case of soil chemistry in an area in Kenya where I do a lot of work. So this is graphs of soil pH. That's what determines whether you need lime, for example. So you see a lot of areas have low pH, but some areas within this county in Kenya have perfectly adequate pH. Okay? On nitrogen, most areas don't have enough nitrogen, but some areas do. Same with phosphorus. Here's carbon. Okay? You also see that this is very geographically, there's geographical correlation. Okay, so if you know something about your neighbor's soil conditions, that tells you something about your own soil conditions. Well, it's also the case that there's noise in any soil test. So I grew up in Kansas, and one of the things Kansas State University would do is they have soil judging competitions when teams would go out and do soil tests, and you'd compete on the accuracy of how well you could do that. But in this setting, if you test the soil in a farm and you go back to the same farm and test it again, the correlation's about 0.7. So you're not going to get perfect information even from one test on your own farm. By the way, one test that involves like 20 different samples from around the farm. So obviously they do the basics there. But why have I gone through all these patterns of correlation? Well, they imply that information from neighboring farms is valuable for me. Because since my own test is noisy, since I know I'm correlated with my neighbor's information is going to be helpful for me in understanding what to do. I shouldn't put, if I know the test for myself and for my neighbor and for my neighbor's neighbor, put higher weight on my test, but I should put some weight on my neighbor and in fact on my neighbor's neighbor. And there's statistical techniques for doing this called kriging. Sort of think of this as autocorrelation for those of you who are economists, but in 2 dimensions. Okay. So how does this relate to the economics? Well, these tests cost about $10. So no farmers, to a first approximation, no farmers ordering these tests on their own. These guys have an acre, 2 acres. It's not worth it to get a soil test. Okay? But as part of a study done for unrelated purposes, we got some soil tests done, and we provided that information to the farmers whose soil was tested. But then we thought, well, we'll go to in fact, this is partly how I got involved in this area. We went to the neighbors and we said, would you like this information, and how much would you be willing to pay for it? And in fact, we found that they gave numbers that were much higher than we would have guessed. Okay? These were $2, up to $5. Now, this was a little bit sensitive to how we asked the question. There could be some experimenter demand effects. We saw the effects but one thing we found was, we did this at people's houses. We also did this when we invited everybody to the local school, had a meeting, and then took them aside individually. Well, there's much lower willingness to pay in that second setting. And that makes sense because if I know my neighbors are getting the information, I shouldn't necessarily pay for it. Maybe my neighbors will tell me. Maybe I do a favor for my neighbor, and then my neighbor tells me. Information is not excludable, or it's not perfectly excludable. It may be partially excludable. But that means, and if you remember the evidence from before across multiple settings, we saw that there were impacts on the people who didn't have mobile phones. So if you're trying to make money off of selling information, and you need to get a lot of people purchasing, well, in a setting where a lot of people are purchasing, the incentive for, the information is likely to leak to other people. And then you no longer have a market because people won't pay very much if they can just get the information from other people. Okay? So when we do this, we find that the cost is is $10 for an individual farmer. The cost per person, if you gave the information to everybody in the area, is about 15 cents. The willingness to pay, we get a range of estimates, but they're much higher than 15 cents. So this is a classic public good. It's not worth it for an individual to purchase it, but it is worth it for the society as a whole to purchase it. In this sort of a setting, there are limitations to how well a straight subscription model will do. Let me mention, one possibility would be what you might call a Netflix model. So if you think about what Netflix is doing, it's giving you movie recommendations and selling you movies, but it tailors those recommendations to you based on what you've liked in the past. Okay? Well, you have an incentive. That makes the information a little bit more excludable, which is great for them as a company, because you can't, they are better at predicting what you'll like than, say, the New York Times would be at predicting what you like. And but it's also the case that it creates an incentive for customers to provide that information. So customers provide information knowing that will create an incentive, that will help the company give them better recommendations. But in the process of providing information on what movies they like, they help the company build a better model of what advice to give to other farmers. Because, so if I go back to these maps, one thing you can do is soil testing, but you can also just imagine you gave recommendations to farmers and you collected feedback on did it work, did you use it, did it work? Well, since there's this spatial correlation, what works for a farmer over here is probably going to be correlated with what works for a nearby farmer. So you may be able to, either through in a private company or in a public setting, try to create incentives for farmers to contribute information. And we saw at least in some cases, some evidence that farmers would contribute that information. Another example where farmers would have incentives to contribute information, there's actually been an outbreak of a pest called fall armyworm, which was common in Latin America, or in the Americas more generally, but hadn't been in Africa. Recently crossed over to Africa, has spread very rapidly. Farmers are unfamiliar with this pest, so they want to know what to do about it. But they particularly want to know what to do about it if it arrives on their fields. So if a farmer sees a pest, they have lots of incentive to report that and ask questions about it. But that information on where the pests are, it can be useful to other farmers. So that would be another example of this potential Netflix effect. Okay. But just to return to this to the public good point, in both of these settings, the Indian setting and the Kenyan setting, the total valuation was great enough to make this a worthwhile investment from a social point of view. But it was very hard to see how this would work, how this could be profitable privately. Okay. I talked about the issue of excludability of information, and that might not be perfectly excludable, and that makes it harder to run a private business. But let me point out a further issue, which is the way you deliver the information might affect the excludability. So there's some evidence from what we're doing in Rwanda, and I should say this is still preliminary evidence, but it suggests that so 1 Acre Fund organizes farmers into groups. If you send diverse, we did a bunch of experiments with 1 Acre Fund, different ways of sending messages. Some of them involve sending the gain-framed message or the loss-framed message or all sorts of behavioral ideas. One thing we found was it looks like when we varied the message within groups, there was more take-up in those groups than in messages where everybody got the same message. And that might be because if people are getting different messages, they start talking to each other about them. So that that's an example of the way you deliver messages might affect the extent to which people discuss it. And to the extent that's the case, you have to think about what are the incentives for either a profit-maximizing firm or for social welfare. From a profit-maximizing supplier, the last thing they want is people sharing the messages. So they would try to find ways to deliver the message so that they're not easily shared. And you could think they would want to tailor the message. For example, they deliver it at a particular time or a particular way that makes it harder to share. From the point of view of a social planner, obviously you want people to share the messages because if you get people talking to each other, lots of things may emerge beyond just the initial message that you sent. Okay, so how could you address these problems? Well, there may be some ways that you can address these problems within a market framework. So a lot of these issues particularly arise when you're trying to sell to individual farmers. It's also just a very basic business problem, which may outweigh all of these problems, to be frank, which is just customer acquisition costs are immense. If you talk to tech people, or business people in general, that's a big thing they talk about. If you're trying to acquire individual customers and then you're getting revenue of 10 cents a month from that customer, that's not a great business to be in. Well, there are some cases, like sugar, where you can sell to a sugar company that has 100,000 farmers that it works with. That's great because then they can purchase access for all their farmers at a fixed price. They say, we're paying a lump sum, then all the farmers have access. Well, in that type of a situation, then you eliminate the deadweight loss because even the farmers with positive valuation will call in and benefit from this, even if their valuation is not at the average level. Okay? You can also address the issue of non-excludability, because if you're the sugarcane company purchasing this, then it's great if farmers start learning from each other and don't all get it directly from the mobile phone system. And in fact, you want them to design it to encourage that, okay? So there are a lot of advantages of this. It's still not going to get you to the first best. Why? Because the price that the sugarcane company is buying from the farmers at a price that shares the rents of the sugarcane production between the farmer and the sugarcane company. So if the sugarcane company is getting half the rents from that, then they're only going to put half the value on the gains they'll only value half of the total social welfare gains from this. They won't value the gains that remain with the farmer. Okay? You could possibly get around that in certain crops where producer cooperatives are common. So for example, dairy. Or when there are NGOs that are socially motivated, like One Acre Fund. Obviously, this is also restricted to certain crops. So there are a lot of crops for which this is important. This type of natural monopoly exists, but there are also a lot of crops, in particular staple crops, which a lot of the poorest farmers in the world are producing, where this alternative won't be available. Another strategy, which I think is very interesting, is advertising or actually selling the inputs. So there's a firm in the United States which is doing precision agriculture, and they give very high tech, and they started out trying to sell this as a service, but then they realized inputs are overpriced. They recommend inputs. They could recommend their own brand of inputs, and that's their current financial model. So this connects to another big issue in the economics of information, which is asymmetric information. So obviously, there's a possibility for an information provider to abuse their position. They could. So let's say it's even just within a subscription model. Okay? I'm fooled by this all the time. I always click on my Google News and I see these headlines that sound like they're amazingly important things. I always fall for it time after time, but the actual news isn't that important, or something that's going to benefit me isn't going to benefit me that much, or some airline deal or whatever. So you could just oversell the information. And I think there are lots of reasons to think this is a real problem with subscription models. But once you get into advertising or selling goods, then you have to worry there could be misleading info to oversell these products. So, of course, farmers, if you work out the equilibrium of this, it's not, I seem to be fooled consistently time after time, but the economic models say that we should be smarter than that, and if you think farmers are smarter than that, then they're going to put limited trust in these systems. They're going to be willing to pay less for them, and that's going to further hurt the ability of these systems to work. Work Cole and Sharma have done on agri-dealers suggests that's a very important problem for the shopkeepers who are selling really scary things about farmers are consistently using very dangerous pesticides which are banned in the EU and in the United States and are actually completely useless for the particular problems these farmers are facing. There are safer pesticides that are available, but the shopkeepers say, buy it all, and the farmers do that because they think it's safer. Now, this in some ways is a negative of an advertising system, but I should note that one way to address this is by developing a reputation for providing quality information. And it's possible that one of the reasons why shopkeepers may be particularly likely to provide bad information is that it's very hard to check on them. If you think about a large organization that's operating in many, many different markets, their temptation to over-recommend in one market might be smaller if they think, well, there could be an expose on them, or that could provoke government regulation, and that could hurt them in other markets as well. So it's possible that you could address this. I think you're never going to completely eliminate it. There's still going to be issues of emphasis. So if you're selling product or if you're advertising, and you have to decide, do you recommend the agricultural approach that involves more input? Say there's two good approaches. One involves more input use. The other involves, spacing of the plants. You're going to put more emphasis on the one. It's hard to imagine that they're going to put as much work into promoting things that don't bring in revenue. Okay, so but I nonetheless think this is potentially a more promising strategy than subscription-based models. Okay. Let me note, I started with very traditional market failures, but in this context, there's some IT-specific market failures. Let me start with spam. We typically assume it's free to throw away information, but it's not. And the private incentives to send out messages might be bigger than the social incentives. Here's some data, which is quite interesting. Working with One Acre Fund, they tried experimenting with the number of messages. What they actually found was one message wasn't enough, and that actually makes sense. People can easily miss a message, particularly if their phones aren't charged all the time, and they don't have possession of their phone all the time. It's shared among lots of family members. But two messages did pretty well. They actually, I don't know whether this is statistically significant. This is exactly the sort of thing that will need meta-analysis and more experiments to really tie down. But it actually looked like there was a decline, that you actually had a negative effect beyond that. Maybe people start to ignore the messages. And you would have to worry at some point that you'd get negative effects on, if people start ignoring these messages, maybe they also ignore other messages that they should be getting on health, for example. Okay. There are also a bunch of issues on privacy, particularly if you're connecting this to financial markets, for example. You can download all the information on somebody's cell phone, and you can get a pretty good sense of credit rating from that, perhaps. But we might have concerns about that. Okay, these are all market strategies. Let me think about government strategies as well. And this is something where I would argue I was much more surprised by what we found. So there's lots of accounts of government failure that we think about in economics involve things like weak incentives for government workers, elite capture, corruption. All of these things are very relevant in traditional in-person agricultural extension. The agricultural extension workers don't necessarily get out to the field. When they do, they visit the rich farmers, the educated farmers, and there's corruption if they have any control over inputs. Okay? So we thought maybe these would be the issues with this as well, although they might be easier to control because you can monitor things more easily. Okay? What we found was abundant government failure, but of a very different type. So let me give some examples of this. So governments in India, they're actually multiple governments are quite into this idea, maybe for good reasons, but maybe for bad reasons, but they're quite into it. These were, in India, they did something that I couldn't imagine in Kenya because it's so expensive. They're testing, so certain state governments are testing the plots of doing soil chemistry analysis for all the farmers' plots and distributing personalized soil health cards to the farmers. Here's what the soil health card they designed looks like. These are very difficult for farmers to understand. Many farmers report never receiving them. 70% of them distrust the content. By the way, asymmetric information can be an issue with governments, not just with private firms. The government of Pakistan, or Punjab in Pakistan, something quite quite similar. Okay? So, so here's some evidence from Cole and Sharma. They worked on a simplified design, okay, that used color coding for, do you have not enough? Is it sort of borderline, or do you have enough of a particular chemical? And then sort of went straight to the recommendations, what the farmer might care about. Okay? Baseline comparison, they also looked at using ICT to help communicate this. So you don't just get a card, but you get they tried different levels. They tried just an recorded audio message. They tried a video, higher tech. They tried actually putting you on the line with a trained agronomist. What they found was baseline comprehension was 8%. Any of these methods get you up to 40%. Weren't actually statistically significant differences among those, but even if they were, it's much more expensive to put an agronomist on the line than to do a recorded message. So it looks like you get most of the way there with just the audio message. Okay? The government of Odisha is now rolling out improved soil health cards with audio messages on a wide-scale basis with support from the Gates Foundation, based in part on this work. Okay? Here are some things from East Africa. So similar patterns there. You often get many different messages on a whole range of different agricultural topics. You get lots of caveats. Okay? Some of the 1 acre fund messages, maybe they went too far the other direction. You should use lime. You could say, well, you don't know for sure the soil acidity on your thing. It should be much more caveated in your general region. There's often a problem of lime. You should try this out, experiment with it. Okay, but the government messages are full of the caveats. You often have very technical language. You don't get that much message repetition because they're sending a lot of different messages. So here's an example of a message. If your soil has a pH of less than 5.5, use lime. Farmers don't know what pH is, and they certainly don't know whether their pH is less than 5.5. But you can see how, if you're in a committee with other people with, PhDs or master's degrees in agriculture, and you're sitting around the table in the agriculture ministry, and you have colleagues who are objecting to certain messages, you wind up with a message like this. Okay? So this is sort of designed by committee type issues and designed by technical specialists in agriculture without a lot of thought about communication. Okay? Here's another East African example. They actually set up a very large, in this country they set up a very large system, but a lot of people, this was a voice system, but a lot of, so press 1 for information on weeding, press 2 for information on fertilizer, et cetera. That one, a bunch of people never made it to the actual content. You have to answer a bunch of questions. Your gender, because they want to know gender of their users, which province you're living in, et cetera. Okay. And people would drop out throughout. Because analyzing the data just within their system, without actually doing any, this is all very cheap, no surveys of farmers, just analyzing the data from their interactive voice system, we're able to show the huge dropout. This is a simplified version of the chart, but there were more and more, there's a whole string of hurdles you had to get through to get content, and you got a huge reduction in people getting through that. If you think about, an app that you might use, say something like Waze, you start using that app, and very quickly it starts telling you which way to drive. Okay? It could ask you a bunch of information about, do you want to pay tolls? Do you want a curvier, twistier route, or do you want the slower but straight route? And eventually it does ask you those questions. But it starts off very quickly giving you useful information to you. And you could imagine that coming out of, if you think about a game between the system designer and the users don't know whether this app is going to be useful for them. They may not be very patient. They want to see something positive, and if they don't see something positive soon, they're going to drop out. The app designer, of course, would like to collect as much information on people as possible. But in a context like that, the private sector seems to have come to the conclusion that you should start delivering content pretty quickly, that that's the equilibrium of that game. But this government, they thought, as agriculturalists, we want to get a lot of information on people so we can give them the right recommendations. And as a result, people never got that far in the system, okay? But so we tried an A/B test, working with them, and just postponing the user registration led to, a 20% increase from 52% to 63% in actually accessing content. Okay? There are a bunch of other areas that just basic analysis of their system, worked with a data scientist who came up with all sorts of suggestions for them. And they're now going through and they've accepted, they're doing A/B tests and they're accepting a lot of these. Some of the A/B tests, by the way, suggest that the initial ideas, just from the data analysis, actually didn't work. But they're now doing what a private sector company would do, analyzing the data, doing A/B tests and adjusting their system. Okay. So I think it's a very different type of government failure, but nonetheless, it seems to be a very common problem. But the difference with this type of government failure is that it's responsive to evidence. If the problem is corruption or elite capture, it's not clear whether you can do anything about that. That just may be, in the short run, a fact of life. In this case, we've worked with a number of governments, and this work is through PAD generally, and we found not only very widespread interest in governments in implementing systems like this, but we found they're very responsive, even in cases where they already have their own existing system, to evidence and particularly to A/B tests. And that suggests that part of the problem in the government operations is that they're missing the feedback loops. And if you think about the private sector, tech companies have very rapid feedback loops often, and they build those in. Governments often don't do that. There's also they don't have data scientists working in the agriculture ministries, and they can't afford them. And they also have, they don't have units, why do the data scientists even think about some of these things? Well, because they know people in the industry, and they've worked in, there's a lot of common experience in interactive voice systems. Lots of companies have them. But those aren't the people who are working in the agriculture ministry. So I think it's a set of challenges that are quite very real that make the government less effective, but at least in principle, potentially easier to address. Okay. Okay. So partly I'm saying that because the experience of PAD, which started off doing small-scale research, then working with 1 Acre Fund, we've suddenly had a lot of interest from governments. India, Pakistan's just still developing, but India, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, we're working at very rapidly moving to scale. I think this type of approach, governments are going to have lower customer acquisition costs than individual companies. In part because they can do things like authorize the telecommunications company to send messages to everybody and ask if they want to participate in a system like this. Okay. I think this example suggests that there's potential in the sector. I focused on agriculture, but I think similar things could apply elsewhere. So I gave the example of educational choices before. So people who are deciding between the LSE and Paris School of Economics, they're they have a lot of information. Maybe they have behavioral biases, but it's not that they just lack any information. But if you think about, I'm involved in a project in Colombia, there's a huge proportion of people going on to tertiary education. Nobody in their family has been to tertiary education before. And they don't know whether there's a huge growth of private tertiary education programs, many of which are terrible and have a very low graduation rate and even if you graduate, you can't get a job. And that's true in the US as well, by the way, but even more true in Colombia. One of the things that the Obama administration wanted to do was to provide information to parents so they could on this. And they tried, but they actually couldn't do that much because the data wasn't available. Well, in Colombia, a bunch of the data is available. They have data on what institution people go to for secondary school, what their secondary school exam is, what institution they go for tertiary, whether they graduated, what their tertiary, they have an exam at the end of tertiary that they can judge, a nationwide exam, and then they can link that all up to labor market data. So that all of that, so they can see which people get jobs and which ones don't. All of that information is theoretically, you can look that up on a bunch of that on the web, at the aggregate level. But individual households making choices for tertiary education don't have access to that information. So I'm working with Chris Nielsen and others on an effort to try to develop a chatbot that can provide, that would automatically be sent out by their educational testing institutions in secondary school when all people take their exams, would say, okay, given your scores, here are some, most people go to schools near their neighborhood, and how much do you think you would make? What do you want to study? I want to learn to be an X-ray technician. Do you know how much they make? Then you find out, they say, have you thought about being a dental technician? Do you know how much they make? You could ask questions like this and have a conversation with people through the chatbot and provide a lot of this information. So I think a lot of, there's going to be important differences in that context, but I think a lot of this will carry over. Okay, let me just conclude with a couple of slides. So first, just summarizing. Even with the existing basic efforts in this area, there's a very high ratio of benefits to marginal cost. If you think about technological advances and linking things up across sectors, there could be potentially much, much greater benefits. When I talked about the market failures in the private sector, they almost all went to undersupply of this relative to the social optimum, not oversupply. In the government sector, there's probably also government failures that lead to undersupply, even though governments are quite interested in this. The existing programs are going to typically take priority. The salaries will take priority over non-salary expenditure. So I think there's probably undersupply. So you might think there's a case for subsidizing this. Let me argue there's actually a case for a particular type of subsidies from international institutions, which is that if you think about, I guess it's most clear in the case of a firm. Imagine a sugar company setting up a system. Imagine they set that up, they've got 100,000 farmers. They'll get benefits from it. Maybe they judge the benefits are adequate to do it. There's a lot of things to learn about how to do this well. What types of messages should you send? When should you send them? How many repetitions? What behavioral techniques to use? How to encourage communication back? They're going to keep all of that information private. They're not going to share it with the other sugar companies. It'll eventually leak. They'll hire, other sugar companies will realize what they're doing, hire people. But, then I'll get to the other sugar companies. But is it going to get to dairy, to maize? Probably not. Okay? Some similar things with NGOs and even with governments. When the government of Odisha does this, they might help out the government of another state when they send a fact-finding delegation. But a bunch of implicit knowledge, or even things that could be explicit, aren't going to spread. And what's more, we sort of talked about how conservative governments are and how they're not very good at feedback loops. They're probably going to not experiment enough. They might experiment enough from the point of view of their own individual. The best you could hope is the government of Odisha would experiment enough for the benefit of Odisha. But any lessons they learn, if those lessons could be diffused, those lessons would benefit a bunch of other states, a bunch of private firms, et cetera. So there's going to be underinvestment in this type of system, but there's going to be underinvestment in learning, and then there's going to be underinvestment in making the results of that learning transparent and data transparency. And I think that suggests that to the extent that international institutions, we heard about the EU, so to the extent the EU wants to subsidize this, I would suggest, I wouldn't say, go all market or all government. I would say, work with a lot of different players, but just say, we'll support you to do this, but we want you to, A, be transparent in the data that comes out of it, and B, if possible, experiment with it and document the results of that experiment. I think if that's done, then we'll see increasing returns to the sector, not just because the cost of a mobile phone message is basically zero. That would say that the marginal cost of reaching an additional farmer is zero. I would say the marginal cost of reaching an additional farmer is actually negative, because the more farmers that are using this, the more opportunity there is to try different things, and you need big samples for this, learn about what works, and then feed that back into the system. And that sets off, potentially, a virtuous cycle, because the better you can make the system, the higher adoption you'll have, and that in turn creates the opportunity for further improvement and further adoption later on. So I think this is a very exciting area, as you've heard, and happy to take questions and discuss it.
Thank you. Forgive me, but when one needs to approach it from a slightly wider angle, the first, you have not referred to the lack of land tenure and land planning. Now, that is rather crucial. There was a bloke called Stiglitz, I can't remember what happened to that very good bloke, who said land tenure has not been addressed by the elites of Africa because it would have alienated their own elites. The second thing is that the EU, bless their cotton socks, are supporting the expansion of commodities for export. Now, an organization called the IMF, you might have heard of them, have been saying for a number of years that the prospects for earning from commodity exports in the next decade are going to decline. The result of that, in some of the places where I work, tobacco growing, not only is less tobacco being used because Philip Morris and so on have decided, oh no, and so on, the local farmers are not encouraged to produce for local consumption. And the third element, if I may, and it comes back exactly to what you have said about education, education is not geared particularly to women farmers who are the key people in development in sub-Saharan Africa. So all that you have said is great, but may I suggest that a wider approach is still required?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, for that fantastic talk. I just wanted to know your opinion on how risk is distributed in these types of transactions, because ultimately this is advice coming in whatever form, it's processing data that's collected, but at the end, where's risk really in this transaction? It's with the farmer, right? So just wondering, what your thoughts are on that and how that could be addressed. Thank you.
Can we take one last one? There's too many there to save time.
Hi there. I was just wondering, in cases where smallholder productivity is hampered by risks of overproduction, where a market for those crops may not be guaranteed, did any of these studies factor in the potential for this structure to serve as like a marketing platform, either to transition, capture a large amount of small holding networks and sell or integrate into vertical supply chains or into local organizations, institutions that serve food, for example?
I think we stop here.
Okay, great. So on the first question, I completely agree. This is one small part of a bigger picture. There's a certain, I'm bullish on these technologies. I think they can make a difference, but we're talking about 10%, 20% gains, which I think would be wonderful, but you're not going, you have to address all these other issues as well. On the issue of risk, I think that's a very important and very, very tricky one that really needs a lot of thought. I argued that the governments might, in some cases, be, in my opinion, they might be excessively cautious, but you could also see the private sector being not explaining the risks enough of what they're advising, because they may focus on the metric of adoption or of yields and not think about all of the other issues. So then, is regulation necessary? Certainly in theory, there's a case for regulation. How do you set up that regulation so it doesn't become a source of rent seeking, et cetera? Very complicated questions. And then on integration with supply chains, I think that can be very, potentially that could have dramatic effects. The sugarcane example provided one example of that just within a single company, but there are lots of other cases where maybe you're a farmer, you're buying inputs and you have 5 input dealers. Maybe you can shop around a little bit further and find out you get better prices and quality somewhere else. But equally, as you were saying, on the output side, you may be able to arrange for much more competition to buy your goods, and that may give you much better prices for your goods. And may open up whole new markets to you. So.
Hey,
If I may, one of the questions from Twitter to Michael. Great to see similar data applications in inputs and access to markets and finance. What about value chain optimization? We have seen apparent gains in transparency and certification.
Right. I think there may well be very important gains there. I was focusing on the previous question just on arranging for your produce to be picked up or your dairy to be picked up by a transporter. There could be sort of efficiency gains there, but as is being pointed out, it might be possible to link this up with certification for things that need to be certified for quality, for export, et cetera. For example, in coffee, right now it's very difficult to, quality makes a huge difference to the price that a farmer is going to get, but it's very expensive to do individual testing for an individual farmer. There may be ways with appropriate data systems to make that easier. So I think there are potential opportunities there.
okay, just that last one.
I get to be the first and only woman to ask a question.
That's why I let you ask it.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit about how market structure across the world will influence the rollout of these technologies. And you've talked a little bit about the danger in the US in terms of market power and sort of the more the market problems, let's say, in terms of companies abusing controlling the market for inputs, for example. And then you talked a little bit about the importance of natural monopolies when it comes to sugar versus other crops. So I wanted to ask you if you can think a little bit about the varied market structures that you're doing research in and how you think that's influencing the potential benefits and the potential dangers of this technology. Thank you.
I think that's an intriguing set of issues. So let me clarify one thing. I think there was I don't know the US market so well, but my understanding is there were a lot of pre-existing market power and inefficiencies in the agricultural input market. And this company coming in, I think so far, they've probably improved the market by increasing competition so far. But obviously you have to worry about what would happen in the long run. I think one key way in which market structure makes a difference is, I think if you're talking about a commodity crop like maize or rice, I think then it's going to be a market model that relies on selling to individual farmers. A subscription model is going to be very hard. In the case where there is an intermediary institution, which I think does tend to be tied to the processing technology, like dairy, like sugarcane, then there's more hope to sell to an intermediary institution. And I think that's a more promising market-based approach. But I would draw important context between sugarcane, where it tends to be, sometimes it's cooperatives, but often it's just commercial companies, and dairy, where it's more frequently cooperatives. You're probably going to get things structured in a more advantageous way, at least, I mean, not say that, there's a lot of corruption in cooperatives, so at least more potential to get things structured in a more advantageous way for farmers through that. But I think, one of the reasons why I'm probably more optimistic actually about among the market-based mechanisms of selling inputs is, or selling advertising, is simply because a lot of crops are like maize, and I'm pretty pessimistic on the charge the farmers for the information model.